They dragged him from his car, slammed him with false charges, until he revealed who he really was. Late at night in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the streets were mostly still, the only sounds being the occasional flicker of traffic lights changing from red to green. Jamal Winslow, a seasoned assistant U.S. attorney, had just finished a dinner with colleagues. Work, injustice, courtrooms, none of that was on his mind. He was only thinking about home. That changed the second red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Letting out a sigh, he signaled, pulled over, and reached for his wallet. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a light. There was absolutely no reason for a stop. But Jamal knew better than to assume reason had anything to do with it. Two officers approached. On the driver's side stood Officer Kyle Driscoll, tall, broad, his military-style haircut making him look even more severe. On the passenger's side hovered Officer Brent Kessler, leaner but no less intimidating. "License and registration," Driscoll ordered, his tone clipped. Jamal calmly handed over his documents. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Driscoll exchanged a glance with Kessler before replying. "Your taillight's out."
A lie.
Jamal knew it. His car had passed inspection just days ago, and in the reflection of his rearview mirror, his brake lights shone clearly. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, keeping his voice even. Driscoll's expression shifted, ever so slightly. He leaned in. "Sir, step out of the vehicle." A slow tension crept into Jamal's limbs. He had prosecuted cases like this, where a simple stop spiraled into something far worse. Instinct told him to comply, but experience told him these officers were already escalating the situation. "I'm not stepping out until you tell me why," he said, his voice firm. Kessler smirked, resting a hand on his belt. "Because we said so." Jamal took a steady breath. He knew the law inside and out. He had spent years studying, enforcing, and defending it. He was fully aware that unless there was probable cause, he had every right to stay in his car. "I'm within my rights to ask why I'm being ordered to step out." Driscoll's patience snapped. He yanked the door open. "Step out.
Now."
Before Jamal could react, Driscoll grabbed his wrist, yanking him forward. His seatbelt locked against his chest, digging into his shoulder. "What the hell are you doing?" Jamal barked, instinctively pulling back. Driscoll didn't answer. He just pulled harder. Within seconds, Kessler was on the other side, twisting Jamal's arm behind his back. Cold metal cuffs clamped down on his wrists. "You're resisting," Driscoll said flatly. Jamal stared in disbelief as Kessler pressed him against the hood of his own car. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from rage. This was a setup.
A game.
And these officers thought they had already won. But they were about to realize just how wrong they were. The courtroom inside the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse buzzed with quiet murmurs, the rustling of papers, the occasional cough. But beneath the routine, something heavier lingered. Jamal Winslow sat at the defense table, his posture rigid but composed. He wasn't here as an attorney today. He was the defendant. The charges? Resisting arrest, obstruction, disorderly conduct, complete fabrications. But Jamal already knew. The truth didn't matter. Only what could be proven. At the front, Judge Margaret Holloway presided. Mid-60s, stern, her reputation was firm, unforgiving, and completely uninterested in nonsense. From the way she barely looked at him, Jamal already knew where this was going. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, walked in with confidence, the kind that came from knowing the system was on his side. Straightening his tie, he nodded toward the officers sitting at the witness stand. Jamal watched as Driscoll and Kessler sat smugly, assured they had the full weight of the system behind them. "Your Honor," Calloway began, "this is a simple case of an individual escalating a routine traffic stop into a physical altercation with law enforcement." Jamal exhaled slowly. The arrogance. The audacity. Calloway flipped through his notes. The defendant refused to comply with lawful orders, became aggressive, and had to be restrained for the safety of all involved. Jamal's lawyer, Thomas Rivera, an overworked, underpaid public defender, stood abruptly. "Objection. There is zero evidence my client acted aggressively." Judge Holloway barely hesitated. She waved a hand dismissively. Overruled. Jamal clenched his jaw. That was fast. Rivera sighed but pushed forward. Your Honor, the officers escalated this situation without just cause. No body cam footage shows my client acting aggressively because no such footage exists. Calloway smirked. Body cams weren't operational at the time, but the officers' statements are more than enough. Jamal almost laughed at the absurdity. Their word was all they needed? Convenient. Driscoll took the stand first. The defendant was combative from the start, he said smoothly. Refused to exit the vehicle, raised his voice, created a hostile situation.
Lies.
Every word. Kessler followed up, nodding. He tensed up. We feared for our safety. We had no choice but to restrain him. More lies. Jamal's hands curled into fists beneath the table. He had spent his entire career fighting against this kind of blatant corruption. Now he was living it firsthand. Judge Holloway barely concealed her impatience. She turned to Rivera. Anything else, Mr. Rivera? Rivera hesitated. He knew this judge. Knew her track record. She didn't care about fairness. Still, he swallowed hard and pressed forward. Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Jamal Winslow to the stand. This was it. Jamal stood. As he walked to the witness stand, he felt the weight of every gaze in the room. Watching. Judging. Waiting to see if he would break. But he wouldn't. Because what was about to happen would change everything. He took a seat, exhaling slowly as the court clerk swore him in. His hands rested lightly on his lap, but inside, he was burning. He wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to expose the truth. Calloway stepped forward, pacing. Mr. Winslow, would you say you complied with the officer's instructions? Jamal met his gaze, steady, controlled. I asked why I was being ordered out of my car. That's not illegal. Calloway sighed theatrically. You refused to exit, correct? I asked why I was being asked to step out, Jamal repeated. Which, legally, I have the right to do. Calloway smirked at the jury, as if Jamal's intelligence was an inconvenience. And after multiple orders, you still didn't comply. Jamal held his stare. Because there was no lawful reason. Calloway turned to the judge, shaking his head. Your Honor, it's clear? Jamal leaned forward.
His voice was calm.
Steady. Before we go any further, I should probably disclose something. Silence. Calloway hesitated. Even Judge Holloway finally looked up. Jamal reached into his briefcase. His lawyer stiffened, uncertain. Slowly, Jamal pulled out his badge. A small, simple rectangle that suddenly became the most dangerous thing in this courtroom. I'm Jamal Winslow, he said, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District. And in that moment, the entire case imploded. The weight of the past few weeks pressed down on her shoulders, the protests, the relentless media scrutiny, the leaked files. Every path forward was a bad one. She glanced at her notes, but everyone in the courtroom knew the choice wasn't really hers anymore. It belonged to the public. She exhaled slowly, placing her gavel down with care. After reviewing the evidence, the court finds the defendant. A hesitation, just for a second. Then, finally, not guilty. A surge of relief crashed through Jamal, but he remained still, unmoving, because this case was never just about him. Across the courtroom, the officers sat rigid, their faces drained of color. Kessler's fists clenched, his future flashing before his eyes. Driscoll, the more arrogant of the two, leaned forward. Your Honor, She lifted a hand, silencing him. The court will also be forwarding all relevant materials to the state attorney's office for further review. And that was it. They weren't walking away from this. The courtroom erupted. Murmurs.
Gasps.
The rapid clatter of reporters' keyboards. For the first time, the system had turned its gaze back on itself. Jamal rose slowly. His lawyer gave him a firm pat on the back, but Jamal's focus was elsewhere, on the officers, their confidence shattered. On Calloway, the prosecutor, who looked as if he had just lost everything. On the judge, who had spent years dismissing cases like this until today, when she had no choice but to act. But most of all, he thought about the people who weren't in this room. The ones who had sat in this very seat before him. The ones who never got to walk free. As he stepped beyond the courtroom doors, cameras flashed, reporters shouted, cheers rose from the crowd. But Jamal wasn't celebrating. Because this wasn't a victory. It was proof. Proof of what had always been happening. Proof that only with the world watching did the system finally react. And he knew the fight wasn't over. Not for him. Not for those still trapped in it. He moved past the flashing lights and into the mass of people, where voices demanded real change. Because one case wasn't enough. And now, no one was looking away. If this story made you think, even for a second, ask yourself, how many more stories like this exist? How many people never get their day in court, their names never make the news, their truth never gets heard? It's not enough to witness injustice. We have to challenge it.